What picture in the American mind better encapsulates feelings of nostalgia, patriotism, or longing for a place than small-town America? A part of our spirit is stirred when we see historic photographs of a simpler time, or when we see a film like It's a Wonderful Life. Set against the backdrop of massively populated urban centers filled with faces we don't know, the small, rural community reminds us of Mayberry, familiarity, and a deeply shared common good. In these scenes, children often litter the streets with shouts of play, and the average citizen walking the sidewalks has a timeless class in their style of dress and posture. Despite the plight of small-town America since the economic downturn of 2009, and for many decades before that too, the small-town vibe holds a special part in the American soul. The sense of belonging and appreciation towards small-town America is also widespread in other forms of art. As Jason Aldean recently demonstrated in his song, Try That in a Small Town, even the politics of small towns are vastly different than left-leaning, childless blue cities. These small, local places dot the map of America's heartland, connecting two left coasts and trying to preserve whatever is left of a more traditional way of life. Tracy Byrd captures these emotions in his song, I'm From the Country, with the following chorus. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody calls you friend. You don't need an invitation. Oh, kick off your shoes. Come on in. Yeah, we know how to work and we know how to play. We're from the country and we like it that way. Chippewa Falls is the quintessential picture of small-town America, rich with history and nostalgia. One Chippewa Falls resident was even awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery in battle during World War II. The town was built on the banks of the Chippewa River in west-central Wisconsin due to the proximity to the largest stand of white pine in the upper Midwest. The Chippewa Lumber and Boom Company built the largest sawmill under one roof in the world. Support of the logging industry brought other manufacturing, including new flour mills, a woolen mill, cigar factories, multiple shoe factories, and a broom factory. Many of these businesses have since closed their doors, but one has remained. The business that evokes the most pride in the residents of Chippewa Falls is the Jacob Leinenkugel Brewing Co. You would probably recognize the canoe with scrolling red letters on a bottle of Summer Shandy or Honey Weiss, the company's most popular brews. Jacob Leinenkugel immigrated to the area from Germany and opened the brewery in 1867, making Leinenkugel Brewing the seventh oldest brewery in the United States. He found many thirsty lumberjacks and began brewing his family beer. Surviving the changing economy, wars, and even prohibition, Leine's, as locals call them, continued to brew beer in small-town Chippewa Falls for 6 generations. Unfortunately, they decided to sell the family brewery in 1988 to Miller Brewing Company. And through the typical charade of corporate musical chairs, the company is now owned by Molson Coors. Despite the sale, the Leinenkugel family operated somewhat independently of its bigger corporate owners. Dick Leinenkugel, one of the owners of the brewery, spoke about the nature of their relationship with Molson. He said, quote, "The dynamic changes over time and certainly with leadership and the strategy of the company. In the early years, Leinenkugel Brewing Company was afforded a bit more freedom as it was not material to their parent company." End quote. In an interview in 2013 with CNN Business, Jake and Dick Leinenkugel were asked how the ownership of Molson Coors has changed or not changed Leinenkugel Brewing as a business and as a brand. This was their response.
Looking back over 25 years, has it been the right thing for us to do? No question. We've had 3 different expansions of our brewery. We've had a new brew house that we never would have had the opportunity to spend that amount of money. The quality of beers has been getting so much better because of that. The investment in a 400 distributor, national market presence, great branding, marketing people, the media areas that we never had access with advertising our product and our name were wide open for us. So I look back and over the 25-year period, it's been a start of a new generation of Leinenkugels being able to come in, run, manage the business, report back to a larger brewery entity, ask for more things to grow our brands in the right way, and also is it smart to keep the family in play as far as leading the company. And I think that the smartest thing Miller Coors is doing is saying, that a Leinenkugel should be running that, or Leinenkugel's involved in the business, because it's authentic. They love beer, they're smart, and they want to continue to grow these brands within a larger brewing company.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, obviously a lot of changes, and Jake talked about some of those, but what really hasn't changed is that family guidance, that family management of the business. And importantly, the brewing team. The same brewmaster that was there in 1988 is the same guy that's in the seat today, John Burrow in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, producing award-winning quality beers.
While respecting the brewery's history and family legacy may have been important to Molson Coors in the early years, a recent announcement seems to have changed those thoughts.
An iconic brewery is closing in western Wisconsin.
Tough news. Leinenkugel's brewery parent company, Molson Coors, says the production of the Wisconsin beer brand will be centralized now in Milwaukee. While the drinks will not disappear, it is still a big hit to the Chippewa Falls community.
It is. Jake Hulse was there today to hear from workers and families who are still coming to terms with the news.
Leinenkugel's Brewery is the city of Chippewa Falls, and in turn, Chippewa Falls is the brewery. That connection between the brewery and its employees and neighbors has existed for 157 years.
It's really tragic. I mean, it's tragic for our family, for the community. I mean, we've grown up with Leinenkugels and Chippewa community. You think about community, you think about Leinenkugels.
Tragic for Rose Byers' family because she says her husband has worked in the brewery for 30 years and they were told that will end in January.
30 years is a long time growing up with Leinenkugels, owning the brewery, getting to know them as a family. Getting to know all the people that work here as a family, it's pretty tough.
Byers says the parent company of Leinenkugel's, Molson Coors, told employees about the closure Wednesday without specific reasons why. According to the Molson Coors website, the location employs 120 people, and the shock is still setting in.
You know, Leinenkugels, the brand, the name, the beer, the everything, it's Chippewa Falls.
The former president of the Jacob Leinenkugel Brewing Company, Dick Leinenkugel, was shocked by the brewery closure, stating that he was, quote, deeply saddened by the decision. For over 157 years and 6 generations of family management, Leinenkugels has been brewing great beers for our legions of fans throughout Wisconsin and across the country. None of our family members were aware or counseled ahead of the decision, end quote. Molson Coors reported declining beer sales in its August earning calls, with brand volumes declining 7.3% in its last quarter. CEO Gavin Hattersley told investors the company would make moves to cut costs in order to offset the slump. At this point in history, the boom and bust story of small-town America is almost cliche. Many towns were built around the virtues of Anglo-Protestant ingenuity, hard work, and courage. Natural feelings of kinship, community, and place were the glue that bonded people together. However, something has changed in American culture since at least the 1950s. Many things have caused these changes, such as the deracination that followed in the wake of 2 world wars, the sudden influx of investment dollars into publicly traded companies, and a globalist view of economics. The first evolution of the modern global economy was the gutting of small towns in favor of much larger and more profitable multinational corporations. When large corporations consumed small businesses, their insatiable greed led to a desire to increase profitability no matter the effects on the people and places that depended on those economic engines. Unlike local businesses that employ people in the community they know and go to church with, that their kids play baseball with, the work is centralized and disconnected from real people with faces. A corporate financial analyst looks at quarterly sales drops of 7% and concludes that consolidation of manufacturing would compensate. With that simple calculation fixed on a bottom line, and without anyone to look in the eye, dozens or hundreds or thousands of people lose their jobs in a small community. The responsibilities that business owners and employees typically share in a community are distant and foreign, sometimes literally, in a corporation that can span different states and even multiple countries. Faces, names, wives, children, goals, dreams, and loves all become a line on a balance sheet titled payroll expenses. Some of these corporate giants even have good intentions in the beginning. For example, Steve Jobs famously insisted that Apple products should be manufactured in the United States. In her book Boomers, Helen Andrews wrote the following, quote, Jobs insisted that the Macintosh computer be built in America, and the operations team complied, building a factory in Fremont, California in the East Bay. When investors in Next pressured Jobs to outsource manufacturing to Asia, he refused. Even when Ross Perot resigned from the board in protest, he refused. There were benefits to having your engineers and your factories in geographic proximity, Jobs firmly believed, and cheese pairing wasn't necessary because his products didn't compete on price. End quote. By all accounts, Steve Jobs was an idealist. He disdained utilitarian calculations when making business decisions and highly valued innovation. He famously refused to consider market studies for Apple products, believing that data was no substitute for the right stroke of human intuition. Tim Cook, however, changed the trajectory of Apple's innovation and manufacturing. Jobs hired Cook because he knew the data-driven man would take care of the portions of the business that Jobs found boring. We must thank or blame Steve Jobs for the technocratic evolution of the world due to his foresight and obsessive desire to create new tech. The villain Jobs may be, but where his reserved and unimaginative successor has failed to continue innovating, Cook did effect a revolution of sorts within Apple. Cook could not match Jobs' product innovation, but he could make Apple more profitable by other means. To do so, he cultivated a relationship with the notorious Taiwanese tech manufacturing company Foxconn. The company has received abundant criticism for its poor working conditions, workers' riots, explosions, toxic chemical exposure, and shockingly low wages. Instead of manufacturing Apple products in the United States, hundreds of thousands of jobs were given to China because of that pesky line item, payroll expenses. Again, with the same globalist and corporate greed and indifference to any local people or place, Apple squeezes the workers for the lowest cost to increase profitability. And so under Cook's direction, Apple became the model company, no longer for its innovation, but for its corporate profit and shareholder value. Many other Silicon Valley technology companies have mimicked this model. Employees in the U.S. are forced to wear 90 hours a week and loving it t-shirts to work, while overseas companies crank out electronic goods at minimal cost. But what happens when you've outsourced all the jobs you can outsource? What happens when you have streamlined every process that you can streamline? How do you keep increasing your bottom line or dividend value then? Well, glad you asked, because next, Apple took a new approach. What was it? Replacing American jobs with H-1B employees. In fact, as of 2023, Apple was approved for nearly 3,000 H-1B visas. An H-1B visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows foreign professionals to work in the United States for a temporary period. Tech companies, including Apple, with the 8th most H-1B employees, operate under the public claims that there are Einsteins in India, China, and other places around the world, and we need to use them. For what it's worth today, and despite Jobs' earlier idealism, Apple directly employs 164,000 people around the globe, and fewer than half of those employees work in the United States. Apple has 3,833 H-1B employees, or around 5% of their USA workforce, along with 1,415 green card employees. Apple employs Korean companies Foxconn and Pegatron for manufacturing. Estimates for employees designed to manufacture Apple products in China are somewhere north of 350,000. These Chinese employees can produce 500,000 iPhones per day. This means that Apple can cheaply manufacture a product with foreign labor, charge Americans a small fortune for it, and simultaneously replace those same Americans on the factory floor. These are the kind of globalist policies that could only come about when you don't have to look people in the eye after you've shipped their job and means of survival off to a foreign country. It is an economy not for neighbors, but for robots, shareholders, and serfs. While the banks all closed in Bedford Falls, George Bailey kept the building and loan open. But why? Because he knew every face personally. The H-1B program was intended, or so its public defenders say, to attract the best and brightest people from all over the world to support American companies. America is, after all, the land of opportunity, and perhaps in the slums of India, there's a genius with a PhD in electromagnetism sitting on piles of research and world-changing inventions in a place where no one cares about anything beyond Bollywood. As it turns out, the H-1B program made headlines again this past December after Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy took to X to signal the need for more H-1B visas. Many on the right resisted, which took Musk seemingly by surprise. As Dave Greene wrote on his Substack shortly after the dustup, the real issue is that the Silicon Valley oligarchy may have helped Trump get elected, but they are hardly in touch with the base of working-class American sentiment. The backlash suggests just how out of touch the new techno-elite really is on some of these things. Here's the Vivek tweet. Quote, "The reason top tech companies often hire foreign-born and first-generation engineers over native Americans isn't because of an innate American IQ deficit, a lazy and wrong explanation. A key part of it comes down to the C word, culture. Tough questions demand tough answers, and if we're really serious about fixing the problem, we have to confront the truth. Our American culture has venerated mediocrity over excellence for way too long, at least since the 90s and likely longer. That doesn't start in college, it starts young. A culture that celebrates the prom queen over the math Olympiad champ, or the jock over the valedictorian, will not produce the best engineers. A culture that venerates Corey from Boy Meets World, or Zack and Slater over Screech in Saved by the Bell, or Stefan over Steve Urkel in Family Matters, will not produce the best engineers. Fact. I know multiple sets of immigrant parents in the 90s who actively limited how much their kids could watch those TV shows precisely because they promoted mediocrity, and their kids went on to become wildly successful STEM graduates. More movies like Whiplash, fewer reruns of Friends. More math tutoring, fewer sleepovers. More weekend science competitions, fewer Saturday morning cartoons. More books, less TV. More creating, less chillin'. More extracurriculars, less hanging out at the mall. Most normal American parents look skeptically at those kinds of parents. More normal American kids view those kind of kids with scorn. If you grow up aspiring to normalcy, normalcy is what you will achieve. Now close your eyes and visualize which families you knew in the 90s or even now who raised their kids according to one model versus the other. Be brutally honest. Normalcy doesn't cut it in a hyper-competitive global market for technical talent. And if we pretend like it does, we'll have our asses handed to us by China. This can be our Sputnik moment. We've awakened from slumber before, and we can do it again. Trump's election hopefully marks the beginning of a new golden era in America, but only if our culture fully wakes up. A culture that once again prioritizes achievement over normalcy, excellence over mediocrity, nerdiness over conformity, hard work over laziness. That's the work we have cut out for us, rather than wallowing in victimhood and just wishing for or legislating alternative hiring practices into existence. I'm confident we can do it." End quote. Among other things, Vivek's tweet demonstrates what the left would call racism, only this time it's directed at native whites. According to him, the reason Americans are having economic trouble is because everyone is, to put it simply, lazy and incompetent. Here is a man claiming to be American who hates everything that America once was and is supposed to be. He does not share the Anglo-Protestant values of hard work within a community of kin and people in place, all bound together with Christian love. It's worth noting that Vivek, for all his talk, has never invented anything. He's simply a glitzy fundraiser. He has no expertise in software engineering or in Silicon Valley other than chumming it up with the uber wealthy. Greene writes, quote, "What was wrong with Vivek's tweet? Well, to start, Vivek sought to blame Americans for what was done to them by their government. It was also supremely condescending. But more to the point, Vivek's words were impossible to divorce from the anti-white racial angle of the rest of the online discourse, not least because he implicitly brought race into it. There was even a sort of pseudo-sexual component in Vivek's tweet that could be felt in his expressed bitterness against the football stars who dated the prom queen. The jokes write themselves. But it got worse. Substantively, the steel man of Vivek's idea was nonsense. The notion America needed more nerds who didn't play sports or have fun did not stand up to 10 minutes of considered thought. At its height, Western countries always had leaders with both the qualities of the sportsman and the nerd. The warrior scholar was always the Faustian ideal. America had only recently become comfortable with the idea of pure technocratic rulers and the supremacy of the nerd, and this over-specialization directly corresponded with society's decline. The idea that the key to success in the 21st century was just grinding tech knowledge harder and going full tiger mother on American kids was ridiculous. After all, that's what South Korea did. And how did it work out for them? The Vivek tweet put the cherry on top of the H-1B sundae by highlighting almost all of the misconceptions of our ruling class and how they still couldn't quite see the problems right under their noses. This was very cathartic, but what did we actually learn? What does this mean for the future of politics? Well, the first thing that I think we have learned is just the nature of the vibe shift that we have been experiencing over the last several years. The standard political categories that we have grown up with don't make sense anymore, which was readily apparent if one observed the H-1B controversy play out in real time." End quote. Greene is right to notice the vibe shift, which seems to include, among other things, the recognition that Americans are tired of being replaced by low-skilled foreigners who will apparently work endless hours without complaint. Greene's article, Adventures in H-1B Human Capital, also offers insight into the failures of this controversial visa program and dispels many of the myths from this early 90s program. First of all, the H-1B doesn't actually go to geniuses. There is, in fact, a different visa application for such instances. It's called the O-1 visa for individuals with exceptional abilities. What the H-1B actually does is import low-cost labor to replace low to mid-level jobs, thus taking them away from Americans. Greene writes, quote, "It was easy to verify through public data that H-1B visas were commonly granted to workers in mid-tier entry-level positions, the very jobs that middle-class Americans felt locked out of. The only benefit was that the foreign employees worked for less money." Musk and his friends also didn't realize that Americans in 2024 had much more experience with these kinds of immigrants, primarily from India, and their experience was not positive. This is an easy oversight for people with brains stuck in the 1990s, when a point-based system was the holy grail of immigration policy. But we tried the point system, at least in Canada, and the results were not stellar. Far from getting a new tech elite, the country was just flooded with mid-skilled, pushy immigrants whose economic benefit was swamped by their catastrophic impact on the housing market and social services. And needless to say, these immigrants did not assimilate into a Canadian culture, although often their cultural deracination would be presented as assimilation by the ruling elite. You cannot go anywhere in Canada without seeing the native population actively displaced by newcomers, supposedly brought in on the basis of merit and doing otherwise middle-class jobs. And for some reason, despite all of this high-skilled immigration, Canada didn't become the new Silicon Valley. I guess the new immigrants didn't have any Einsteins among them. Maybe we just need to import more people. Maybe, as Sam Hyde joked, we can import everyone in the entire world into America, and then we would be guaranteed to have the next Einstein, assuming that this age has an Einstein to produce. End quote. At its very core, the H-1B program is an extension of the Gramscian Marxist ideal of universal homogeneity, global uniformity, the erasure of the particular. It's a denial of nationhood in general, and of the American nation in particular. The leftist framing has it that the Christian European West is some sort of blight on humanity that must be destroyed, which is the motivation for taking jobs from Americans and flooding the nation with foreigners. The H-1B visa program is a subversive policy intended to destabilize heritage American culture and its people. David Greene continues, quote, "Whereas the white liberal defenders of H-1B expansion wanted to status shame Middle America for being racist and not sufficiently colorblind, the Indian defenders of H-1B expansion wanted to status shame Middle America for, well, being white. Needless to say, this didn't work. Platitudes about how we needed to welcome the huddled masses yearning to work free in our struggling multinationals didn't feel particularly appealing when it was buttressed by hundreds of Indians screaming about how whites were an inferior race that deserved to be conquered and replaced. Maybe this is just what assimilation looks like, but the conversation only ever got more ridiculous, more insane, and somehow more boomer. It got to the point that the pro-H-1B team started calling all native-born Americans of any race lazy and uneducated. On the one hand, there were the likes of Joel Berry from the Babylon Bee, claiming that Americans just couldn't match the talent of imported Indian labor because we had somehow systematically miseducated ourselves. On the other hand, there were hordes of online internet users from the subcontinent bloviating about how American natives didn't have the will to power necessary to work 80 hours a week and on holidays like Christmas. Keep in mind that this battle largely took place on Christmas. So I guess the people writing these tweets were all hard at work doing their highly technical jobs American natives were unqualified to do. Was their job to post anti-white, anti-Christian diatribes online constantly? Perhaps, but that is certainly a different take on hard work than the one we hear about from the boomers. But hey, maybe this was just a case of internet crazy. After all, for the most part, all of these sentiments were just tweet fights between online personalities. And it might have stayed that way had not Vivek Ramaswamy intervened with one of the worst X posts of all time, embodying how the worst aspects of the pro-H-1B side could exist in one brain, not on the internet, but in the real government officials that expected to rule us. The reason top tech companies often hire foreign-born and first-generation engineers over native Americans isn't because of an innate American IQ deficit, a lazy and wrong explanation. A key part of it comes down to the C word, culture. Sadly, Americans have been co-opted to support this gospel of unfettered immigration, which is nothing less than a purposeful suicide of the West forced upon us by our elites. How should Christians and Christian pastors address this needless destruction? We'll talk about that in this episode of the King's Hall Podcast. The King's Hall Podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world.
Well, gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall Podcast. We Three Kings. Once again, Dan Burkholder, small town American, Scandinavian,
college
Norwegian.
Town. Yep, that's right. Yep.
Go.
I just want to, Eric, thank you for dressing up for this occasion.
Yeah, I try to do what I can. I'm trying to bring, actually, it was a blue collar podcast.
It is.
Working class America. So what is more working class, Brian, than Carhartt? Is your blazer Carhartt?
Yeah, well, first of all, no, because Carhartt sold out to the gays.
Oh.
So my blazer is handmade by Heritage Americans.
You mean the Vietnamese? I think is what you're referring to.
That is what I mean, yes.
Welcome to this episode, gentlemen. It's good to have you. Of course, Dan Burkholder, we mentioned, Brian Sauvé, Eric Kahn. We're going to be talking about the H-1B visa fiasco, which I did think it was interesting, dropped on Christmas, that the oligarchs found that was a good time to do that. So we'll get into that in just a moment. Brian, we do have some exciting things coming, including conference.
Yes.
June 12th through 14th in, Ogden, Utah.
Let's go.
What better place? I don't know. A lot of people have been asking me about this. I don't know if you've got these questions. Registration is actually up. We've yet to announce speakers, main themes. I don't know if you're prepared to say anything just to whet the appetite of the listener.
Yeah, I think it's about time to start unveiling a little bit of what we're going to be doing and why we're really excited. This episode actually fits really well with some of the things we're looking toward with the conference, which really combines a few elements, Lord willing. We're looking to re-examine some of the spirit of courage and exploration that drove everything from the settling of the American West to the age of exploration, focusing on some of the things that have made especially our nation great, looking back through American history and trying to draw some lessons and inspiration from those things, and then put some practical handles on them so that we might, stand on the shoulders of our forefathers. remember and honor them, and then also really like do them proud, do them justice. And we think that really is a lot of the work that needs to be done in this day, is that kind of courageous spirit of settling, standing against the evils of our day with courage and stalwartness, and reclaiming and renewing some of the glory that we've lost in this Protestant and great nation. So I hope you guys check it out. You can go to our website, newchristianpress.com. There's a conference tab right at the top. I think that the specific location is newchristianpress.com/2025. And you can get tickets already. They're at the most discounted rate you're going to find them currently right now. They get more expensive as we get closer. And I know, hundreds of you are already signed up and going to be there. So really just a great place to meet some friends, network. We have more networking events than we've ever had at our conference. So for pastors, for business leaders, for singles, which we've already had several marriages from our last one.
We have.
Praise God.
Yes.
And
another engagement recently.
Yeah, and an engagement. So, man, this has become quickly one of the highlights of, I think, our year, just hanging out with everybody. Really, like, conference talks are great, and we aim to make sure that they are well worth your time. And not just rehashings of things you've heard 50 times before, but well worth your time. But even more than that, the brotherhood, the camaraderie, the fellowship, I think that we, how often do we all, like us dangerous, canceled people get together and be friends in the flesh. So looking forward to it.
Yeah. So stay tuned. We'll be announcing speakers for the conference. I think, I think we can safely say Joel Webbin will be there.
he'll be doing Impaling Part 2.
Joel said,
perfecting your technique.
Joel said, "I will be there whether you invite me or not."
Not only that, he said, "I will be there, and I will be speaking. Whether you invite me or not." So
he asked for a 2-hour time slot.
Yeah.
Not going to happen. But
definitely not.
Did he really ask for 2 hours?
We appreciate the enthusiasm.
He did.
What a guy!
What a guy!
At least he knows himself.
He knows himself well.
The thing I do just want to like highlight is that when we put these conferences together, and I hope it showed last year and the year before, but when we put these conferences together, we're not going for, hey, who that has the biggest platform out there that's kind of at all on our team could we get? That's not our aim at all. We're trying to put together the kind of lineup and talks and just the people in the room that are going to do, give the most value, the most compelling, interesting, inspirational, courage-inducing talks. Not just like, hey, we heard that this guy with 600,000 Twitter followers who's like not completely gay, maybe we could get him.
He said one true thing one time.
Yeah. The only exception, and I'll look into the camera for this, enhance, zoom in here. Tucker Carlson. I want to address you personally for a moment. I know that you're listening to this podcast, and I just want to say that I hope you're doing well. And it's just been inspirational to follow your career and your courage. And we would love to have you out for the New Christian and Press 2025 conference. And maybe if Alps wants to, wants to sponsor.
That's right.
The show. I know a couple users here a couple drug users here in the room.
That's great.
Yeah, let's go. Tucker. We'll await your email.
Great. Mm-hmm. So pretty much on lockdown for Tucker 2025. Really excited about the conference. I'm not going to say what Dan is going to do because honestly we don't know, but I hope it involves Pit Vipers and some Sabaton. I think people would be let down.
Nobody has mentioned that I couldn't do it.
The most iconic moment of 2024.
We were actually standing at the side of the stage, and I hear the music playing, and I was talking to some of the other speakers, and I didn't fully know that was going to happen. And I looked at Ben Garrett, and I was like, what is happening right now? And it quickly became one of the greatest moments of the conference.
Maybe I could just do that again. I don't need to speak. I can just do a couple of walk-bys.
Yeah, just a couple
on the stage. Yeah.
All you have to do
Or I'll just bomb your talks in the middle. All of a sudden, Sabaton starts playing like a WWF event, and I come out there with Pit Vipers.
You bribe Martin. You're like, middle of the talk, interrupt.
Yeah.
Hit play on this. And Martin's like, absolutely not. And you're like, Mr. Franklin says that you're going to do it. And he says you can't. What? Still no.
Still no. So yeah, definitely check that out. Again, go to the website, newchristianpress.com/2025. You can sign up for the singles mixer only if you're single. Come on.
Yeah.
Oh my word.
But
polygamists don't.
Did we have to? I guess. All right.
I guess it's Utah. Gentlemen, in today's episode, we're going to be talking quite a bit about people in place. Dan, you were talking about Leinenkugels. You brought this up to me as we were discussing the H-1B visa and kind of what's happened to the American economy. One of the things I found most interesting is how you pronounce the word. I say Chippewa.
Yeah, this was like,
and Dan is like Chippewa.
This is a Wisconsin version.
Chippewa.
It's how they assert dominance on my people.
Yeah, language. You control the dictionary. So could you just say, first of all, what is the proper way to say
proper? The local way is Chippewa.
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 Yeah, I don't know if that's the proper way.
No,
but that's the local way.
My Minnesota family does often say it that way too. Chippewa.
Yeah, Chippewa.
Yeah.
Every time I say it now, I'm going to be self-conscious.
It's an Indian word. Like
yeah,
Native
it is
American. So Brian's people. So
whoa. get you macadam.
Oh man, it's making it come back.
It's been a minute. Yeah, I do have quite a few Chippewa ancestors.
You're related to the Chippewa.
Yeah, my grandmother's half Chippewa, I believe. No, she's some large percentage. My dad was the last generation that could get a card for the reservation, which I don't know why you'd want one because it's like one of the worst cultures like literally ever to exist. So
have you received any reparations for?
No, we don't even have a casino. Like we're not even, there's no benefit whatsoever. I visited the res one time and I almost got stabbed and I was 5.
It actually sounds like
young.
A res experience.
Yeah.
Yes.
A kid accused me of digging a hole in his yard. First of all, I was like, you call that a yard? Looks more like a patch of dirt to me, right? But then he was like, you dug this hole. And I was like, I didn't dig the hole. And he was like threatening me with a knife. So then my brother waded into the pond and immediately cut his foot on a jagged piece of glass from a broken bottle of what we call firewater.
Was it Leinenkugels?
It was not. It was probably...
You see how we're tying it all together?
It was probably Cuddy Sark.
Story time with Brian Sauvé.
Yeah, so anyway, Chippewa.
Chippewa. Great. Dan, back to Chippewa.
Yeah, Chippewa Falls is actually really close to my hometown, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It's just up the road. And so Leinenkugels has always been something that's actually invoked a lot of pride in the area, especially like you can find it all around the world, really, but especially all around the country. I guarantee you, if we go to a local bar, they're going to have Leine's on tap.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's just, and so that story, when it came out that they were closing the brewery, that was actually like kind of a hit. Mm-hmm. That's why I connected it when you said we were going to talk about H-1B. And I'm like, you know who doesn't have any H-1B employees? Leinenkugels. But no, the reason that I thought of it is because you actually have this evolution of corporate greed and globalism, really the globalist economy, to where you start eating up the smallest economic centers, which are small towns. And then you go and they feeds this globalist beast. And so really I was trying to show the evolution where it starts at the small town, and you've got a small town of something that they're actually really proud of. They employ it's 125 people at this brewery. It's not a ton of people, but there's only 14,500 people in Chippewa Falls. Plus there's the Leine's Lodge, which is like a tourist destination and conference center and things like that. And so people will come there and do the tastings, and then they get the brewery tour. And it's really cool because it was started in 1867. And so it's just rich with history. And so there are other businesses that rely on the tourism that, that brewery attracts. And so it's really felt more than just that. And then another thing is that it actually strips people of their identity, because that was something that was local to them. Mm-hmm. There's one of the interviews, the guy has like a Leine's tattoo, because he's a Chippewa Falls resident. Yeah. He's just really proud of this company that's local and has really made it big. And the corporate greed, they just, without looking anyone in the eye, they just eat it up because, like we said in the cold open, because of that one pesky expense that's titled payroll.
This is what Pat Buchanan was getting at in The Death of the West when he said that the transnational corporation is a natural antagonist of tradition And this is the kind of this, because there's a million examples of this, that these corporations exist for the pleasure and profit of their shareholders, right? And they have no loyalty to any particular people or place. And so naturally, especially when large corporations purchase these smaller local companies and make them subsidiaries, or, just adopt them into their brand of Coca-Cola or Yum or whatever, Coors, whatever this one was, they deracinate. They pull them out from the roots. And it's like they're trying to pull this native plant out that grew in this one place, in this one climate that marked this one region. And they just want to, sort of make a neutral, copyable version of it that they can plant anywhere in the world and think that they're getting the same thing. But it always ends with the destruction of custom, tradition, peoples, their place, the particularity of a community.
Yeah, you even kind of get this feel when, I had friends when we were in the gun industry, we would travel to these small towns in America, because you're usually hunting in the middle of nowhere, whether it's Oklahoma or Idaho. And I had several friends, my inclination was probably more like Ben and Brian, where I'm like, I want to go to a great local eatery, somewhere like Chili's.
Chili's, by the way, it is a joke. Chili's is not good. If you eat there, you will feel like dying. So anyway,
within minutes. But one of the things that they would do is say, no, let's go to a local place. Let's figure out what the local brew is. But we're finding in our culture that because of the Leinenkugel type thing, there almost isn't anything left of local breweries. So even in Colorado, you had all these local breweries, and they would start, and then Coors would buy them up, and then they would start producing it in their factories, and it would, like Blue Moon is a good example, it would lose all the contour of what that beer was before. Mm-hmm. It was just easier to produce the way they did it. My question is, do you think that this is, like, are we just embarking on some form of, like, dumb nostalgia? We just want to relive some time period piece. Or, and this is probably what we would argue, this actually comes down to, it seems, love of neighbor.
Yes.
And nationalism, the nation being an extension of the family, that we actually love our particular people and place, not just this monochromatic thing that's global and doesn't mean anything to anyone. So do you guys agree with that? Which side would you kind of argue on that point?
Yeah, I mean, think about, I'm still just, I think it's easiest to see these things through particular glories in the world that we can recognize and taste and see and touch. Like, I think of something like tobacco or like scotch, and the production of these things, they're tied to a place. And when you taste a really good scotch, you're taken in a way to that place. You can taste the sea salt, and you can taste the landscape and the people and the history and the tradition. And these are, this is a thing that sits in a tree that really grew somewhere, and like an oak tree that really, it had roots down in soil, and it's, grains that grew in a particular climate, and it aged in a particular place in Scotland in this case. And so you can't universalize scotch and have it still be scotch. You can't universalize like the tobacco that's grown in the American South and have it still be the same thing. And the reason we need to see these issues not as just exercises in nostalgia, where we're sort of longing for an arbitrary previous era for no good reason other than it invokes a feeling of nostalgia in us. We actually need to see that the erosion of these things is the result of an evil, unethical, anti-human, anti-God ideology that is attempting to swallow the world, which is this universalizing, like what Gramscian Marxist, this universalizing globalism that seeks to erode everything and homogenize everything, and basically turn everything into just this one faceless, anti-particular mush that has no edges or contours or glories. And the reason I say that's evil and an assault against man and God is because God didn't make the world like that. God did something different. In his wisdom, he made a world full of variegation. And it's for the same reason that egalitarianism is evil, eroding all of the hierarchy and all the distinction between the sexes. It's equally evil to do that with the rest of God's creation, with nations and peoples and places. And God really did make a world where he he wanted there to be such thing as England. Like God did that in France and Scandinavia.
Well, it's interesting, even the boomer impulse. So, Dan, you're probably familiar with this from your just vast experience in business college, but that's a joke. You can.
I was like, I can't tell. His
did go to business college.
Yeah, but come on. How good was the business college?
I mean,
you can tell me. Did you learn this lesson?
I'm an owner in a successful business.
Dude,
so.
see? It paid off.
It just took like 20 years.
That's what I was getting
All I had to do was everything they told me not to do.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, let's face it. Business school is just, it's an easy degree that you can go out drinking on the weekends, for other people.
Leinenkugels.
Yeah, Leinenkugels. Hey. Anyway.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah.
So my question is, when you think about, I think part of this is like the 20th century boomer impulse. So you think about Ray Kroc and McDonald's. So just one snapshot of what the company did. It used to be that the restaurants were kind of unique to whatever region the restaurant was in. So, for example, they used to produce a variety of potatoes that they would use for French fries. And then what they realized was, well, let's just do, I think it's the russet potato now. That's why they're so big, is because it was easiest to put through the machinery. And we're going to standardize it where every McDonald's uses the same product, freeze-dried, russet potato. But you can also see what that did to take away, Brian, all the variety that you would have experienced. It used to be the case that restaurants were like sourcing food locally. That was like a normal thing to do. If you're going to have French fries, you find somebody semi-local that is going to produce the potato. But now it changed the way that row cropping worked. It changed a lot about the economy, agriculture, et cetera. But it also took away the variety, the uniqueness and the distinctiveness.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just the variety, but if you used Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin as the example. So historically, where did people work and what did they do? Well, like we said in the cold open, there was a lot of trees, a lot of white pines. And so there was a lot of lumber that was produced. And so to support the lumber industry, you had cigar manufacturers. They need boots. So there's the Chippewa Boot Company. That's still up and running today. There was like the brewery. There was other things that started, and it was local, and they supported one another. So even the brewery, historically, they had to source their grains locally. So that is a unique variety. But there's also those are real farmers. Mm-hmm. That means the brewery is interested in the farmers succeeding.
Yep.
And the farmers are interested in the brewery succeeding. And then what the brewery would do is after the grains were used, they would give them back to the farmers for feed. And so it's this whole symbiotic relationship where everybody had a shared interest in one another's success. And it really does. What does that do for a family, essentially an extended family, a town, is that you're actually for one another. Now, if you look at the employment of the average citizen in Chippewa Falls, it's going to be in corporate tech, it's going to be in healthcare, or it's going to be government.
Yep.
Those are the main employers in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin today. And so where's the shared interest and success there?
Yeah.
There's just, you're not actually for one another anymore because there's no vested interest in seeing one another succeed. Actually, it creates almost a culture of competitiveness because everybody is competing for just the scraps that the government, healthcare, and tech industry can really give to you. And if you can't get that, then you move and you go somewhere else.
And what it's doing, and this is again why we call it evil, is that it's crushing the properly aligned economic instinct that God really did bake into the world, which is intended to be the love of your neighbor. You ought to be engaging in economic activity, not merely for the sake of your bottom line, which is, it ends up being a short-sighted goal if you do that. It might work for a time, but because it's an assault against God and righteousness, it will ultimately consume itself and create misery. Properly aligned economies are just an aspect of love of neighbor. And so when you take all of the roots out of your actual neighbors and you just start thinking of some faceless shareholder, it does allow you to do that. The guy making the decision about the Leinenkugel Brewery, he didn't have to look anybody in the eye. This is, I know I'm Buchanan maxing a little bit, but it's because I finished The Death of the West recently. He called this the heresy of economism. And he has this great quote. I want to read it here. He said, and the idea is that man is not merely an economic animal. He said, quote, many conservatives have succumbed, because this is a conservative error, quote unquote, neoconservative error. He says, many conservatives have succumbed to the heresy of economism, a mirror Marxism that holds that man is an economic animal, that free trade and free markets are the path to peace, prosperity, and happiness, that if we can only get the marginal tax rates right and the capital gains tax abolished, paradise, Dow 36,000, is at hand. But when the income tax rate for the wealthiest was above 90% in the 1950s, America, by every moral and social indicator, was a better country. So his point is that, and my voice just cracked a little bit because I've been recording vocals for my upcoming Psalms album, which you should all see. But
Dude,
everything's
so
flawless.
smooth,
It's flawless.
I'm proud of you.
Thanks, guys. Wow. See the way that this error works, though, in the theonomic movement in the 20th century. Some of this like 20th century theological instinct to begin to move the Chesterton's fence, to move fences. They didn't know why they were there in the first place. And with NAFTA and with all the like global free trade kind of thinking, we got rid of all of them. And the theonomic libertarian mind, it reads a quote like that from Buchanan and it explodes. It can't think of a higher, purpose of God's law, quote unquote, than to just get to free trade, basically globalism, borderless.
Yeah, you've heard things
low
like
taxes.
Free markets make free men.
Yeah, and it's like, well, hang on though, because actually markets historically were a part of the apparatus of a people in a place that was grounded to the things of that place and the customs of that place. And the economy was an extension of neighbor love. So this isn't a Ludditism. We're not saying that we need to get rid of technological innovation and that people should stop taking dominion in the economic sphere. But when we take the seatbelt of neighbor love and this kind of commonsensical, normal way of thinking about human beings for the vast majority of human history, and we just erase all of those with globalist universalism, what we do is thinking we're wise, we become fools, and all we do is, we end up serving the god of mammon, and we end up serving the god of, stock price go up. That becomes the whole end of the law. What is the chief end of man? To make the stock price go up.
Well, it's interesting to me too, and we'll delve more into the H-1B and Vivek's comments in just a minute. But with immigration, one of the things that has interested me is that the church throughout the 20th century has actually adapted its message away from what you're talking about, that economy and politics really would function under love to neighbor because they're all about relationships with and between men.
Yep.
But now the church is actually promoting things like unfettered immigration, because of a greater opportunity to evangelize or something like this. So what I want to ask you is, do you see these ways in which instead of the church being salt and light and having this historic view on all these issues, which it forever had, now it's just basically American evangelicalism in particular is just finding new ways to put the leftist dogma into our canon. So what I mean is, like, take feminism and egalitarianism. We find all these creative ways to shade it so that it looks like, oh, you know what, the scriptures don't teach biblical patriarchy. In fact, it's actually egalitarian. Let me show you how. Well, they've done the same thing with immigration. So my question is, do you see that? Where do you see that? And why is it problematic? And we'll start with Dan, because he looks like he has an interested face on right now.
Well, and it's a thoughtful face because I am trying to think through, like, where did the evangelical church fall into this trap of this globalist economic, essentially replacing your own people, not loving your own people? And I don't think it's intentional. I was thinking about one of the songs that we sang as children was red and black and yellow.
Red and yellow,
black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. But the problem is then we just said, so because he loves all the little children of the world, let's have them all live in my neighborhood. And I think there's just an unthinking catechism. We've been catechized over time in this globalist ideal that the best culture and society that could exist is pretty much just homogeneity.
It's post-national.
We've transcended nationalism.
Well, see, I think it depends on which point in time you're talking about.
Sure.
But for example, I think it's actually more malicious subversion. So if you look at the OOs, the 2000s, you have guys like Rick Warren who are going to Davos and they're meeting with the George Soros people. And then in that same time period, things that he really started pushing in America were like multicultural international adoption. So these are just different ways to soften the feelings of kinship and people and place. So you have all that going on. Meg Basham in her book, I think, has clearly shown that these people, many of the evangelical leadership was bought and paid for by these, Soros funds or things adjacent to them. So I don't know when all of that started, but you could even go back to the 80s and how Ronald Reagan welcomed the intense Christian Zionists into his camp, the Hal Lindsays of the world, Pat Robertson. So there's always been this relationship, I think, where conservatives kind of found a way into some of the voices of power in the state level. And, there's money involved. There's money and power politics involved. And I think over time, it's like, well, what do you know? Now the theological message of the church has changed to fit some of those initiatives. And I think one of the most famous ones would be like Russell Moore saying things like, Jesus was a brown-skinned immigrant, and therefore we need to love brown-skinned immigrants. That sort of thinking wasn't present in the church in previous centuries. And so then the question, right, this is the question, like, where is this coming from and why is the church being duped? I think money and power being a huge reason for it.
And what you have to understand is that Gramsci was right. So Gramsci was a Marxist. In his theory, like his supposition was that Marxism by force, like Stalinism, Leninism, was not going to succeed. And he located, I think, very intelligently, the problem was that the people themselves were too Christian. Like, it won't work on the West, is his idea, because the people have, with centuries deep of rootedness, they have this Christian knee-jerk discipleship on an instinctual level in all of the ways that they think. And because the Christian, like in the Christian tradition and in truth, grace doesn't destroy nature, it perfects it. So grace didn't, and Marxism tries to destroy nature. It tries to flatten everything, level everything, homogenize everything, and centralize everything, universalize everything. It's like purportedly a system where if anybody anywhere can adopt this universal culture of thinking, and it will, enact utopia. So Gramsci understood that what's going to happen if you try to impose that by force on a people is that it will eventually fall apart. It won't work. And then he identified Christianity as the problem. So instead, the famous slow march through the institutions was his solution.
Media,
we need to
academy,
capture institutional culture-making mechanisms. We need to slowly subvert them, quite intentionally. They literally wrote all this down and said they were going to do it. And then they did it. Media, arts, academy, economy, schools, higher education, churches are one of them that they subverted with an intentional counter novel propagandist culture and even theological apparatus that slowly all of these institutions that create and guard, gatekeep culture were won to what we call Gramscian Marxism. And so the express purpose was to de-Christianize the people so that they could be converted to Marxism, basically this universalist, globalist, satanic Marxist sort of ideology. And so when we look at all these different aspects of the world and we say, that's what they said they were going to do, and then we go, oh, look,
they did it.
They did it. They successfully did it. It shouldn't be a shock to us that there are Russell Moores in the world in something like the institution of the church that are more than willing to either willfully or as dupes, as stooges, play along.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too, because in some ways, the powerful arms of the church have functioned much like a state church, like the mouthpiece for a lot of statist policies. You can think of COVID being one of those where, Francis Collins and other people are going to Rick Warren and all the church leaders and like, this is how you need to tell people that, love your neighbor, you're going to kill grandma if you don't get the vax, whatever. So I think that's definitely something we have to consider as a church, is just the amount of subversion that has taken place. And part of the reason that we've done this work of going back to the old Protestant doctrine is that you've got to get outside of this century and see what were our fathers in the faith saying about, these types of issues, immigration, et cetera. As we delve more into the H-1B and you really look at what the program is, it's not about bringing in geniuses. I think David Greene was really quick to point this out. It's about bringing in cheap labor, and it's largely about importing the third or maybe second world into the U.S. So just from a Christian and theological standpoint, do Christians have a foundation to stand on? Contra Russell Moore. Is there a Christian foundation for saying, actually, you have a duty to your own people? We have I've said things like, we have no moral obligation to import the entire world into America. But Christians are saying that we kind of do. So theologically, H-1B, immigration, people in place, it's all tied together. How do you start to think through the immigration issue?
Well, yeah, I think the first thing is that corporations, through greed, have been played by subversives that want to actually destroy, and I'm sure they participate in it as well intentionally, but I think a lot of corporations just see it as a way to gain more profitability. Because if you go through the evolution, you strip the small town economy into the big corporate giant, and then you export most of the jobs overseas, and then you have to further try to be as profitable as possible for your shareholders. So you replace American jobs in America with foreigners that work for less money. And so that seems very attractive for just the average corporate, bottom line, I guess, if you will. But then there's a different play being run, like you said, is that there's actually this mass importation of people, not just through H-1B, though, as we've seen with illegal immigration.
Only one.
We are being plundered on all sides. And Christians do have a duty to their own people. Because what is actually happening with that? If the goal is a Gramscian Marxist society where there is no Christianity, there is no God but the state or whatever they tell you to worship at the time, then you have to dilute the Christian Anglo-Protestant culture. And the way you do that is by bringing in foreigners with their foreign gods, their foreign culture, and you essentially, you dilute the culture so much that what is it? At that point, this idea of a melting pot is it's asinine. It's ridiculous. You can't have a melting pot where it's like, oh, this is a new and great, glorious stew with Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Jews and Christians all living in harmony, and it's just a beautiful society. That's baloney. No. And so if you want to kill Christianity and Christian culture, even the remnants of it, you bring in foreigners with their foreign gods and their foreign values and morals and social norms, and you just absolutely subvert the entirety of Christian culture and make it useless and impotent.
The answer is not to import foreign cultures, but to convert foreign cultures.
Yes.
So we don't import the nations or export a universalist system of culture everywhere, a universalist system of departicularized culture to everyone. We want to seek their conversion. So we want the nations to be converted, not imported or universalized. The problem really that you're seeing with this is another expression of basically this novel theological apparatus or cultural apparatus that is fundamentally Marxist. It's like you're not allowed to love your own nation particularly and seek its good particularly. You need to seek the good of the whole world kind of generally. The problem is that it's subtle, but it's a perversion of what Christian love actually is. Like, think about the way that that the New Testament repeatedly and continually commands Christians to love one another in particular. So Paul and John and Peter, they're writing to communities of saints in Corinth or across Asia Minor, in Rome, and they're writing to Christians across these places. And one of their most consistent instructions to them, which they received from the Lord Jesus, who said the same, is that they were to love one another. And that was actually going to be the one of the key sine qua non distinguishing characteristics that they were even Christians at all, is that they loved one another. And if you think about the logic of that, it makes perfect sense. The Christian communities were to love one another, and it, as John says, not in mere talk, but in word and deed, right? not in mere talk, but in word and deed, which means that they actually had to be within earshot of each other and close enough to do deeds of love for one another. It was talking about the love of a local Christian community for itself, within itself. And on the basis of that functioning society based on Christian love, you are then able to be of service to other peoples as well. And you can evangelize your city and your place and see the church, other churches established going out in their local places and, that sort of thing happening. But what happens if you convert that very particular kind of love in word and deed to a general kind of love for everybody? Well, no longer can you meet the needs of actually anybody in particular. You're just talking about meeting the needs of everyone. So even on a political level in America, our elites were convinced and our institutions were captured to this idea that it was actually a sin to love America in particular and seek her good in particular. And that's what we see in something like the H-1B program. Pat Buchanan, again, got this back all the way back in 2002. He said that the H-1B program, it's replacing jobs of college graduates in America, and it's a failure to put America first.
Which, by the way, today, if you say, even those themes, like some of the MAGA themes, but America first, people be, oh, you're racist.
Oh, yeah. Think about what would get you in more trouble in the average church. To say something that people would conclude as, in some way racist, or it's like something like that, or to deny the Trinity.
Right.
Which would get you in more trouble in the average evangelical church?
Racism.
Not like you could get the Trinity wrong, and people would be like, they're in process. What if someone walked in and they were like, look, I'm sick of seeing Indian immigrants in my neighborhood. They're destroying this country and taking our jobs. They'd be like, my brother, we need to have you in several struggle sessions immediately with the elders and their wives.
This is actually what Joel...
It's actually already scheduled on the calendar.
In trouble for multiple times, is saying like, I don't want my neighborhood, and we can think very locally in Utah. I don't want my neighborhood overrun by Venezuelans who are murdering people in their apartment complex parking lots. And those things are happening. Yeah. And we know people in law enforcement that report on this, and you're like, wow, that is awful. Mm-hmm. I don't want that. I think it's also really helpful to think through, because this is tied to the question of what is a nation. If you think of the traditional way of thinking of this was that nations are extensions of the family. That's why even, which was patriarchal, that's why even words we have like patriotism, love for the fatherland, the root word is patria. All right. Father is in what the nation is. So then you think, okay, well, think of a nation like an extended family, and then so you can kind of reverse it and think about, how should I think about the nation? Well, let's start with the family at terms we can understand. Well, if I have Burkholder boys, you have Burkholder boys in your house, and you're thinking as a father, like, well, do I have a greater allegiance to them or to people in Venezuela or India or China? It's really actually a very simple question. I have a greater responsibility to my people. Well, then you have to ask, well, why when you get to the national level can I not say that I have a greater responsibility to my people? As an extension of the family, that just makes perfect sense. I think the other thing that's wrapped up in this, we've done a lot of work in historical theology, going back to the issue of sex piety, going back to William Gouge and Westminster and Calvin. Obviously, we published Zach Garris's book, which you can get at newchristendompress.com. /fathers, honor thy fathers. But we've done this great work, I think, of combating the egalitarian impulse as it affects the sexual issue. But there's also a problem in how it affects nations, race, peoples. I think that one, as I'm looking at the contour, the lay of the land politically, if you thought being called was a misogynist was bad in an intense fight, wait till you start talking about nations. And I think this is just one of those areas where it's going to take a lot of courageous people to realize we're going to have to say true things. Our entire culture, especially post-1964, has just been, this idea, colorblindness, all that. We've been indoctrinated in this. And the immediate impulse that we all feel because of the cultural catechesis is when Stephen Wolf gives a talk like he gave at our conference, you kind of squirm a little. You're like, are we allowed to say these things? And as you think about them, you're like, well, they're true. I know that, but...
Americans have become their own in-groups, out-group.
Yes. And I think Buchanan's really good on this issue. Brian, I know you've been reading him. Another good follow-up book is Suicide of a Superpower. Yeah. But one of the questions really is the will. What happened to the will of the West, which is largely white Europeanism? What happened to the will? This is why so many authors like Pat are talking about suicide. Yeah. There's something in the will that they're saying we ought to be destroyed. It's our service to the world as the world's oppressors for so long that we ought to even desire our own destruction.
Pat Buchanan has a great quote on this. He identified, again, over 20 years ago, 4 potentially fatal dangers to America. He talked about dying populations, that birth rates in the West have collapsed. And this idea signals that a people have lost their will to exist as a people.
Because you're not reproducing.
You're not reproducing. He said, and a lot of this actually has to do with prosperity. Nations that have historically become prosperous have struggled with birth rate. Second is mass immigration of peoples of different colors, creeds, and cultures, changing the character of the West forever, which is a result of that first problem, because it creates a population vacuum, which our elites backfill with immigrant populations that are reproducing.
And more easily exploitable.
Yes. He said the third is the rise of to dominance of an anti-Western culture in the West, deeply hostile to its religions, traditions, and morality, which has already sundered the West. So again, that's Gramscian Marxism, capturing the institutions.
Teaching them to hate their culture, their people, hate their fathers.
Yeah. And then he said the fourth is the breakup of nations and the defection of ruling elites to a world government whose rise entails the end of nations. This is that universalism. And his conclusion is, quote, the West does not lack the capacity or power to repel these dangers, but it seems to lack the desire or will to maintain itself as a vital, separate, unique civilization. That's the problem. America remains the most powerful nation on earth, militarily and economically. Today, that is correct. That is true. Indisputably true. People are like, China this, China is collapsing in its own birth rate and is on the cusp of civilizational issues itself. America remains militarily and economically the most potent nation on earth. But what do we lack? We lack the will to exist as a distinct, vital civilization. And I think you're onto something, Eric, when you talked about what happened to historic notions of sexed piety, and those same passages that are used to universalize and pervert those ideas are used to destroy the particularity of nations.
Yeah.
Like think of in Colossians when Paul says that, before the cross, there's neither barbarian, Scythian, slave, free. Okay, that's 100% true, not counter-signaling Paul. He is correct that in terms of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, the people of God, the spiritual kingdom, which is a royal priesthood, a holy nation, all these things, there is no distinction in your membership in the body of Christ, be you slave or free, barbarian or Scythian, male or female. But then think about what they did with sexed piety. They concluded from that, or they used that as a wedge to say, therefore, that all of the actual distinctions between male and female are nothing. And if you try to prop them up, you are fighting against Christ.
Yeah, even Galatians, right? Taking a passage in the one part, which is saying there's neither male nor female. Mm-hmm. So the egalitarians take that and they want to remove all distinction.
Yeah.
And I think the conservative Christian church, for the most part, there's been a resurrection of people wanting to fight that.
And think about the way that in that same passage, there's neither barbarian, Scythian, slave, free in Colossians. And look at Philemon, though. Philemon, this is an uncomfortable truth for us today. To Paul, the fact that before the cross there was neither slave nor free did not erase the economic situation of Philemon and Onesimus.
He was a slave.
It didn't remove the fact that one was a slave and one was a master.
And Paul's saying, welcome him back as...
Nor did it remove the obligations within Paul's household code for slaves to obey their masters in the Roman world, which was a significant amount of the population of Rome and the Roman world were slaves. So to Paul, we have to think clearly that grace didn't destroy nature, it perfected it over time. So grace didn't destroy, in this situation, the slave and free distinction economically and in terms of culture and time. It didn't remove private property. It didn't remove the fact that there was a husband and wife in a marriage. None of these things were removed. What it did over time is it infused those institutions with Christian love that then went to work and created and perfected that culture. So that it's not that over time in a Christian society, there would never be any instance where, for example, somebody might have to serve in a slave position, like a forced labor because of criminal activity or restitution for crimes, things like that. But what it did is it would over time hollow out in a Christian society, man stealing, and that you would be going and raiding your neighbors and stealing their children and enslaving them and selling them in markets. Where Christianity went, the cultures remained distinctive cultures, but that practice disappeared, right? And the state even enforced. So grace did not destroy nature. It perfected it.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think one of the other things that we can learn about the sexuality issue, right? And then again, in Colossians, you're saying the same thing. The people who do the egalitarian thing with male and female then want to do it with Jew and Gentile. Right. That passage does not mean there's no cultural, racial, ethnic, nationalistic distinctions anymore, because that's not what Paul is teaching. Right. One of the things we could learn, though, is in the 1980s, the complementarian camp came around and they tried to build this halfway house between the historic Protestant doctrines of sexuality and some like quasi-feminist ideology. And it didn't work. It didn't even really slow down the train. So one of the things that I would just, as we're thinking about nationhood, Christian nationalism, as we're thinking about immigration, one of the things I think we have to be careful not to do is build another halfway house on those issues. That we have to just go back all the way to let's just look at the whole history of the church. Let's look at the church fathers. Let's look at the reformers. What were they teaching on these issues? And not do the thing that I've heard a lot in the Christian Reform camp, which is to say things like, well, I mean, Calvin was a racist, though. And you're like, well, according to a, modern post, 1960 definition.
A Gramscian Marxist would want you to think that.
Correct.
Because he wants you to dishonor your father and hate Calvin.
Right.
Right. He wants you to hate the Christian tradition. He wants you to locate within the Christian tradition the greatest evils of the world so that you begin to hate your actual Christian forefathers and see them as an enemy. That's how Christians become their own in-groups, out-group.
Yeah, and I think if you just, for the blue-collar guy, if you're thinking through this, just saying like Gramscian Marxism always wants to erase distinctions that God put there. And so one thing we can say to ourselves is that interpretive grid on these complex situations like immigration is we can say, who in this conversation is trying to eradicate distinctions and who is trying to honor them for what they are? Now, one of the things I think is interesting too about egalitarian Marxist ideology, when you look at the culture, it fundamentally forces you to deny reality. Right?
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. So Brian was talking about Americans losing their desire to exist.
Yeah.
And then with your definition of Gramscian Marxism, that it erases distinctions, what does it ultimately do? It is a dehumanizing philosophy because the ultimate end of every human being is to love. You're supposed to love God and you're supposed to love your neighbor. And so if there's no distinction, who is my neighbor? Like, seriously, is everybody my neighbor? Nobody my neighbor?
Yeah.
And then it erases, like you said, sex piety. And so it removes responsibilities because there's no distinction. It removes this whole leftist framing of race. Well, it removes your responsibilities to your own people, and it tries to pigeonhole you into something where you actually hate yourself instead of encouraging to love your neighbor as yourself.
Well, even this whole concept that Stephen Wolfe talks about, like the shared common good, like in a society that's deracinated and there's no distinction, you're obliterating the common good. There is no common good. There is a suspicion of everyone.
Yes.
And even we talk about like high trust societies. I don't know if we maybe talked about this before, but a lady does a video. She goes to Japan and she goes through like the Apple store and their phones aren't even locked down. You could walk out the door with them, but they have a high trust society. Well, they also inconveniently have a very homogenous society, right? It's not this multicultural wasteland. And so you've got to factor some of those things in.
There is one distinction that is allowed in the Gramscian Marxist world, and it's the distinction between the extreme concentration of power and profit in an elite few that set themselves as gods over the world.
Yeah.
You're allowed to have that distinction because no matter what you try to do, you can't actually get rid of distinction. It's kind of like, to use a weird illustration, do you remember that Dr. Seuss book where the pink whatever, like the stain gets on the thing and then they keep trying to clean it, and so they like use the bed sheets to clean the stain, but then the stain's on the bed sheets, and then they wash them in the tub, and then the stain's on the tub, and you can only move it around is the point. Like, you can't get rid of hierarchy and distinction.
One big spot.
It could be like,
oh, it's in the Cat in the Hat.
Yeah, the Cat in the Hat.
Thank you, Google.
I like to quote really our philosophers and our great thinkers.
Dr. Seuss.
Dr. Seuss. No,
Can you quote him?
No. One fish, two fish. Believe it or not, red fish, blue fish. So
yes,
but it's that kind of thing. You end up concentrating. This is what all of these universalizing instincts end up doing. They just create huge numbers of serfs and a few feudal lords that own. When they say you'll own everything and be
own
happy,
nothing and be happy.
Own nothing and be happy.
Yeah.
They mean we'll own everything and you'll be happy.
Yes.
Happy.
Well, and I think one of the helpful strategies, and we will move on, continue talking about David Greene here in a minute, but one of the helpful strategies is to point out the inconsistencies. So one of them is like, okay, we're told in our country there's a lot of heat on the Christian nationalism. You cannot have any, however you want to define it, you cannot have any Christian, a nation acting on its own behalf for its own good type entity. That's horrible. And we're all pro-Christian Zionism in the country. Israel can do that. Even Black Lives Matter. The black people can be for the black people. And people say, well, that's really good. So I think sometimes pressing into those inconsistencies, and then what you find at bottom, like Pat Buchanan's really good, it's just anti-white. That's the reality. They're trying to destroy Christianity. They're trying to destroy Anglo-Protestant culture in America, et cetera. One thing I do think is interesting from the Dave Greene article, we didn't quote from this, but it's in there and we'll link to it in the show notes. He says there's been a fundamental shift in the last year particularly where the progressive left they're like in their death throes. Nothing they're saying is resonating. You can see that they've even kind of retreated. I think more than likely they're regathering themselves for another assault at some point. Obviously, they didn't go away. But the key fights right now, like the H-1B thing that broke on Christmas, the key fights are on the right, people fighting about what the right will be.
That's exactly right.
And so, again, these upstarts, these oligarchs, Vivek comes in and he says, I know how to run America. And actually, I think Vivek is a great example of why being tied to the Anglo-Protestant tradition should be a requirement for like ruling in America.
Are you talking about Vivek Ramadan Shawarma?
The same one, yeah.
I can't. Is it Vivek Ramakin Salami? I can't remember his name.
It's one of those.
I mean, I pronounced it many different ways.
Classic American last name.
Right there with Smith and Cooper.
Yeah.
So,
Vivek, I'd like to take a moment and address you personally and just say, I know you want to speak at the conference. I'm sorry, but the tweet, it really put you out of the running.
Yeah, it put you out of the running. And I mean, think about this in another way. People are like, oh, you're being racist. America's a propositional nation, whatever. But like if I moved to Japan, even if I became a Japanese citizen, which is quite the process, I don't even know if you could do it. But if I moved to Japan, could I tell people I am now Japanese?
People would laugh.
People would laugh in your face. You're not actually Japanese is the point. And so I think that as we're thinking through these issues, we're thinking about the fight that's going on the right. There's a couple impulses you could have. Number one, a lot of Christians could go, I'm going to ride my pietistic purity spiral horse off into the sunset. I'm going to be a good dispy. I'm going to wait for the rapture. Hope they all work it out. Or I think maybe this would be my thing. I don't know. We ought to weigh in. This is the time to put the best ideas forward and to be demanding that we treat America as an Anglo-Protestant nation, Brian.
So this is the thing with Vivek too that I think is important to understand. Why am I making fun of Vivek like he's not really even an American? What is he doing when he says, what are the solutions facing America today?
He's acting on the interest of India.
He says, let's get more Indians. In fact, America needs to become more like China and India in their tiger mom and in their whatever, culture. We actually need to import their culture of work. Here's the problem.
By the way, horrible cultures.
Yeah, he's saying
they throw poop in the street.
And this is the sleight of hand. They throw poop. So true, King. This is the sleight of hand, though, that's happening. He's arguing for meritocracy, it seems like, which is a deeply American thing. We love meritocracy. We're like, yeah, we want the best ideas to win. We don't want to subsidize bad ideas. We want the best, people, and we want strength to win. And like, that's a huge part of our American ethos. So he's subversively using this meritocratic instinct by changing the rules of the meritocracy away from what is truly meritorious. He's saying, hey, let's create the kind of absolute wasteland culture where people work themselves to death for the sake of corporate profit, 80 to 100 hours a week. That's not a meritorious act. That's evil. That's bad. We should be working like Americans have always done, to love their families, to work hard, to build well, to Sabbath well. We're Christians. We're not communist Chinese. So he's importing a communist Chinese meritocracy, and he's subversively overlaying it on the American populace. Instead, we do need to recognize what CJ Angle did on Twitter in the midst of this conversation. He said, we can recognize Americans in many ways aren't doing well. Like we don't have, our culture is suffering. Our people have lost the will. There are many who've removed themselves from the job market. There are many who have embraced basically apathy. That is 100% true. Why did they do that? They're victims, at least in part. Yes, they're responsible, but they're victims of an evil elite who have taught them through all of their institutional power wielded over decades and generations to hate themselves. So the problem isn't import China and communist culture. The problem is kick out all of the elites who are teaching us to hate ourselves and recover our Anglo-Protestant heritage and learn to love the Lord and love our neighbor again.
Yeah, I think that's great. One thing that brought to mind, I was reading an article recently about the suicide rates in a lot of these Asian countries with that kind of work ethic, where the young people are they're on their 18th week of no days off, 100 hours a week, and they'll just kill themselves. So that's what this thing
it's anti-human
leads to. Dan, I want to ask you about this. One of the things that has been so divisive in the Christian Reform camp, but I think it's been kind of a flashpoint for a lot of people, is White Boy Summer. And it's funny to me because I think among all things, White Boy Summer is fundamentally saying we actually do have the will to defend and fight for our people. And people do not like that. So do you see it that way? Do you see it as for being, a couple guys creating memes and videos or whatever, it seems like it's creating quite a stir. Just how do you read that?
No, it is creating quite a stir with certain individuals more than others. But the way I view White Boy Summer is actually really simple. It's that I love my people and I love my place and I love my history and my heritage and my culture. And they just encapsulate it so well in videos, in video format. And so you watch it and you're listening to music created by my people, and viewing events that have happened, whether it's firefighters saving children from buildings or boxing matches or whatever it is. And you're just like, no, those are my people. I love my people and I love my place. I love my culture. And it'll bring tears to your eyes. That's really what it is. Mm-hmm. This isn't like some grand white supremacist vision for the future to where whites should rule the entire world or some nonsense like that. No, those are my people, my place, my culture. And I love it.
Yep.
And so I want to enjoy it. And I want Indians to love India and I want them to Christianize India.
And repent.
And if they do, they'll stop throwing poop at each other.
Yeah, to repent.
Stop throwing poop.
Stop
my word.
Stop. Like, think about Indian culture. I read a thread recently on X. I can't remember exactly who wrote it, but it was about a guy who'd done a lot of work in India. And I think he was actually an Indian, like he was a native Indian. And he was writing about just how absolutely thoroughgoingly corrupt Indian culture is. You cannot do business in India without bribery, without it's built into the system. They've actually valorized evil. So what do I want? Like Dan said, man, I want the nations to be converted. I want every family of earth, like the Psalms say, to turn to the Lord, and in a way that doesn't destroy nature but perfects it. I want to see India confess Christ and begin the long uphill battle, just like it was for the Germanic pagans that converted. Took centuries and centuries. I want them to become a glory and climb the pinnacle to the pinnacle of their culture.
Yeah.
And so the thing is, and people say that we're racists. Well, you're like, no. I'm not going to go on another rant. That was. I just decided that I wasn't going to go on another rant, and I'd like to now turn the mic over to Eric.
Well, see, the thing is, I really sympathize with the Zoomers because you had talked about Asian culture and how competitive it is and how they don't get days off and things like that. Well, I look at the Zoomers right now, and I saw a Twitter thread the other day. It was like, tell me about your experience, Zoomers. Like, what's your life like? And they're like, I was promised that if I worked hard and I got good grades and I was diligent, that I would be successful, right? And they're like, I got a 3.8 GPA and a STEM, degree, and I've been 6 months out of college, and I can't find a job, and I can't find an apartment, and I'm renting a single room in a house for $1,500 a month, and I don't see any way that I'm ever going to be able to buy a house. And I mean, you look at the Zoomer experience right now, and they've made it into a Asian sort of experience. What is that? What are these kids going to have to do? These young men in order to provide
unlimited streaming services, Dan.
Well, I want to point something out here that I think is important in this conversation, because it's one of the plays that you often see people on the allegedly on the right and in the Christian world will say, and it's stuff like, Joel Berry does this constantly, where he's like, men have a lot of things to fuss about.
Can we just, by the way, when Joel Berry, he's mentioned, maybe Martin can just like a vomit
Can you
sound.
play a... Okay, anyway, thank you, future Martin.
Sorry.
No, he said something like, men have a lot to fuss about, but they're not allowed to fuss. And I'm like, well, yeah, sure. Like, fussing doesn't fix things. But here's the problem. Anybody who would lose the woke Olympics... So if you're white, if you're Christian, if you're male, if you're, a normal sexual person and not a total pervert, like if you're any of those things that would lose the woke DEI Olympics, then anything you do to point out a way that you're being victimized by elites is fussing. Now, anything that someone who would win the DEI Olympics, if they're black or Pacific Islander and obese and, female and some sexual perverted thing, then they're speaking, whatever to power. They're speaking strength to power. Right. So we need to stop doing this because that is just another expression of the discipleship of our culture to be its own in-groups, out-group. That anytime we point out ways in which, hey, like in China, TikTok, the government controls TikTok so that it produces pro-nationalism, pro-China, healthy content. Like they've actually tuned the TikTok algorithm in China so that it like enculturates them in a positive thing. But then the Chinese company that owns it in America, it's tuned to basically sexual degeneracy, like all of the worst things ever. And if a white person like myself looks and says, that seems evil, we should stop letting them do that.
Stop whining, Brian.
Quit fussing, you fuss bucket, you patriarchal, but you're not a real man. Real men never fuss. And you're like, are you retarded? You're probably gonna have to bleep that out. And
narrator,
let me redo that.
Yes, they are.
Let me redo that. Are you an idiot?
Yes. Narrator says yes.
The answer is yes.
Well, I think a big part of it too is Joel Berry's insert gag sound. They function in a lot of ways of just cultural discouragement. Like that's fundamentally what they are. Like gash mews, sandbalots, they're there just to discourage you. And I think part of this, Brian, to your point, we've called it Jesus juking in the past. But if you were to say recognize a real thing, like, wow, there's a lot of Jewish people who control the media, then they would go, oh, what's in your heart?
Yeah, wait a second. What's in your heart? Is that sulfur I smell? I'm like, no, I just like, are we allowed or are we not to say we want our culture to obey the Lord and serve its people well? And there are many wicked subversives who are honestly a small percentage of the populace who are, they are elites. They're institutions, like we said, they've captured institutions where power for culture creation and maintenance is gatekept.
Yes.
And they've subverted those tiny percentage. So when you're saying like, hey, we've noticed that a lot of the subversion in Hollywood is, it's very Jewish. What's up with that?
And they produce garbage.
Yeah.
And haven't made a good movie in decades.
That too. But people will be like, so you hate all Jewish people. And you're like, I actually don't even think that all Jewish people are in on that. That's not the point we're making.
Right.
It's not like we're talking about a coherent view of what has happened to our culture, and recognizing that reality is one of the first steps to actually addressing it. If you continue to play by the narrative that you're allowed to have, guess who came up with what narrative you're allowed to believe? The evil, subversive people concentrated in elite institutions of culture making.
And it's the same play, right? Again, when you do something like masculinity, I've been doing that since about 2020 with Hard Men Podcast. People will say things like, well, masculinity isn't, and then they just list all the actual physical characteristics of masculinity. It's not about being strong. It's not about being chopping wood. It's not being a warrior or a protector. It's not about any of those things. And then they reduce it to this spiritual mush of, real men. And then the list they give is like, real men pray to Jesus, real men. And the whole list is like a woman could do it. Anyone could do it. It's not distinct to masculinity at all.
Is my wife being masculine when she prays?
It's what is happening.
I thought that praying was something both men and women do and wasn't really primarily related to the characteristics of sex piety.
But then you'll get the same thing with, say, like white European Anglo-Protestant culture, where we say like, hey, I am actually proud to be Anglo-Protestant Christian. That means a lot to me. I love my people and my fathers. And then what they'll say to you hear this play, especially in Reformed Christian circles, the play will go like this. Well, I mean, whiteness is just a melanin count. Like it's just melanin. It means nothing.
And we're like, yeah, that's what we meant when we said that we loved like a history of Anglo-Protestantism. Just arbitrary levels of melanin. That's all that was meant, really.
Yes, the reduction to make it sound like your position is absurd. And so I think, this is my thesis, I think that one of the key functions of the King's Hall podcast, just like many other, reading Pat Buchanan's Death of the West, one of the key functions of this show is to inspire people to have a will to fight for, love, and build for their people.
Let's flip and go.
Let's go.
Yeah.
We're just trying to restore the will.
Yeah, just the will. If we could fix one thing in this, moment, that would be the thing that I would pick. Because a lot of people understand many of the problems, but they're too fearful. They're too scared to address them. They don't have the will. They're too worried about being canceled. They're too worried about being mobbed. They're too worried that they're going, because they've embraced and internalized all of these universalist globalist lies.
Yeah.
So we need to fix that. We need to say, yes, it is a good thing to want to say America first, politically speaking. And we're going to pursue the earthly and heavenly good of America. And it's going to require us to undo many of the things that have assaulted and subverted America away from her true, even historical glory. We want to return there.
Yeah, I think that's great. Maybe we'll close with this, just kind of some practical application pulling from, again, David Greene's article. But he says there's really two things. If you don't control the media and you don't control education, and you have I'm adding a third thing. You need elites, who are on your side. So when you start thinking about these things, yes, some of us are in kind of this Gideon position, Lord willing, where it's like, we may be really small. We're a small media company, but we need Christian media, like not quasi-Christian, not Christian post-1980, like historic Reformed Protestant Christian media. Okay, so we need that. We need education. We're doing what we can in our own place, and many people have to do this as well, to educate our children. I mean, how much more based are the kids of St. Brennan's than what we grew up with?
Good.
I fear for the world, actually.
We actually can't even give examples because they're so based. They scare me.
We would be removed from Buzzsprout.
Yeah, we're actually
iTunes and all that.
We're like sitting up down and saying, now there's a time and a place.
Yeah, there's a time and a place for this. But the third one, I think that we have to be cultivating, working on. This is really part of our aim with conferences, I think, moving forward, is building coalition, meeting with guys who can form part of the new elite. We need a new elite. Christopher Lash's book, I think, was really good, The Revolt of the Elites. Our elites in America for a long time have betrayed us. Mm-hmm. They have sold us out like the Scottish nobility. And so one of the things we're going to have to do is cultivate a new elite. And I would just encourage people, no matter how small you think some of these people are, or maybe you yourself are, just fighting the fight, getting out there with your ideas, being in a righteous Christian way, obstinate for the truth.
You matter. People matter. Like, you really do matter. You're really, like, they want you to think that you're powerless.
Yes.
And that you're alone and that you can do nothing to stem the tide, that you are going to lose inevitably. Their worst fear is for even a small percentage of people to say, no, we're not.
Yeah, and I think that should be hopeful with the H-1B thing. I mean, Elon Musk, he looked like he was in panic mode on X when that went down because it was not favorable toward their camp. I think there's a good, hopeful future for the dissident right, but we've just got to keep working on mainstreaming what should be common sense positions.
Yes.
Also, I think finding ways to talk about them is maybe my final thing, but there's a group of people on the dissident right who are like trying to say it in the most transgressive, like offensive way possible. And I think one of the ways that you lead a lot of the middle of the country, a lot of the normies, is you've got to do it in a way that is, first of all, Christian. You have to be Christian in your speech. But this is why we're talking about things like Heritage America. Like, you've got to talk about it in a way that people, number one, understand, but can identify with, and not finding like the most repulsive ways to say it in a way that would offend 99% of Americans unnecessarily.
This is one of the reasons why in the conference, like, one of the big themes we're hoping to really to highlight is American Christian greatness.
Yes.
Our forefathers, the best of us, to say, look to these men. This is our stock. Like, and let's aspire to their greatness, because we have them. We have them in spades.
Yes.
In our history. And we ought to be, and many of them have been blackened by the lies of knaves.
Yes.
And we need to go, and we need to say, no, we're going to, like what we've been doing with the Crusades and many of these other historical issues, we want to say yes to American Protestant exceptionalism. And here's why.
You have the blood of kings.
Yeah.
So go act like it. The blood of Normans, like Dan Burkholder.
One of the other things I think it's really important to cultivate. So positive vision for the future. You matter, and your people matter, and your generations matter. But one of the best ways to protect that is to adopt a warrior-like attitude and spirit. You use Gideon as an example. Well, Gideon gets his army. They go to drink, and God's going to reduce his army, right? And he winnows out by the guys who are drinking like a dog, right? They don't have their eyes up. Those are the guys that are just kind of satisfied. Like, I'm one of the crew, you know, I'm me and my bros, you know, on the dissident right, we're all in this together. And God ends up picking the guys who keep their eyes on the horizon, who cup the water, and they keep their eyes up on the horizon. And you need to adopt that sort of attitude in this political landscape and in this cultural landscape, because the thing you're watching out for are subversives, because they're going to come from everywhere, because people are actually scared.
Yeah.
The left is scared right now, and you need to watch for subversives. You need to watch for people who are trying to get as close as possible to the leftist agenda and to co-opt it, to bring it into the dissident right.
Yes, subversives
to try to
steer.
guilt. Yeah, they steer, they undermine, they gut. They will come from within and try to ruin a movement. So you need to keep your eyes up.
Yeah, subversives don't conquer by power; they conquer by steering. So that's Gramscian Marxism. They conquer by capturing the elite institutions, culture making, gatekeeping, and they steer them with a like acceptable discourse. Here's where we're going, and this is why, like, it's very important that we have this courageous, like, that we maintain courage in these things, because, you know, take J.D. Vance for example. Could be the future of the conservative movement. There's a great possibility, and I think that he's actually more Buchananite than Trump. I think, like, that's pretty beyond dispute. He's recently, even in an interview, I saw him say, like, I've learned my lesson about speaking for President Trump. He's trying to be careful about when he answers a question, because J.D. Vance is clearly like a thinking guy, and he's a principled kind of guy from what I gather and see of him and read of him. So he's more instinctually like a non-political, and he'll just give the answer he thinks is actually the principled answer. It's gotten him into trouble because he ends up not playing to some of Trump's more problematic political instincts. But it gives me hope that even if we can maintain, even if it's a minority, saying, Absolutely no to Vivek. We're not going, Ramadam Swani. We're not going that way. Absolutely no. We're not going to, Shiva, Vivek, Ramakin, Indian Shiva, ... We're not going that direction. I think it can embolden men, even maybe who are biding their time in the party and in some of the elite institutions, to say, over time, we want, it's not, steering is a not whether but which. Someone's going to steer. We just don't want subversives, but we do want to steer.
Right.
So I think part of keeping our eyes on the horizon is thinking in that long term, like maybe not tomorrow, but maybe in 4 years, maybe in 8 years, like maybe we can get there if we maintain courage and keep our eyes pointed forward.
Yeah. So be aware of topics that you're not allowed to speak to, or framing that ends up being manipulative, especially, trying to steer you with sort of emotional manipulation and things
a
like
lot
that.
a lot of the way steering happens is, maybe there's people in your movement, and you get a phone call and it's like, hey, you got to stay away from X, Y, and Z. Hey, don't support this guy. Hey, make sure that you signal the right way on this issue. And so anybody who ends up being some sort of a network node or somebody who's rising in a movement is prone to that. People are going to make phone calls. People are going to try to dox you. And I think this is why it's so important for guys in our camp. First of all, do the reading, like be convicted about what your principles actually are. Don't be just simply a ladder climber. Because there are a lot of guys who will come up and they'll adapt their position to whatever's hot at the moment. And just know, I think for our camp, like we didn't get to our positions because we, wetted our finger and we're checking the wind. It's like the wind call on masculinity in 2020 was, I asked several pastors.
It had a lisp.
And I was like, hey, what do you think about this? And they were like, we hate it. It's stupid. You should never do it. You are one of the most inflammatory people that I've ever met. And I was like, okay, great. Full send. I think that's what that means.
What I heard was Leroy Jenkins.
What I heard was you're one of the better men for the job. Just do it.
There was a twinkle in their eye.
There was a twinkle
when
in
they
their eye
said it. And when they asked, like, what do you think about the name The Hard Men Podcast? And, we said, that sounds really homoerotic, like maybe pick something different. But there was a twinkle in their eye.
There was a twinkle in their eye that said, but it got their attention.
Yeah. It's like my favorite.
Little did they know, like, this is kind of funny, but, I was actually reading books on Rhodesia.
Yeah, it was the book A Handful of Hard Men.
Handful of Hard Men. I was like, dude, perfect.
Yeah.
This is...
So it actually isn't homoerotic. Like I'm all of the reviewers who are disappointed in Eric's podcast, they give it 1-star reviews. They were like, 1 star, not what I expected.
And the people who are offended by it, it's like, you don't even know. Just know I'm holding back. Dan, would you close us down in the most Anglo-Protestant, pro-Norwegian, pro-Leinenkugels? You're like, in your blood, you're a Leine, which German, right? They were German.
They were German.
Are you like the summer shandy?
Don't have.
You're like
sweet,
a little citrusy,
a little bitter.
Do they have a bitter? Do they have like a really bitter one?
I'm sure they have IPAs. I don't know.
So you're like an IPA. No, I'm just kidding.
Just super bitter. Yeah. So you want? Okay.
I was going to make an estrogenics joke, but I won't. Sorry, keep going.
My people. Norwegian white people especially. Those are my people. Anyway, no, here's what I want you guys to just really think through is that in this time, it's really easy to be discouraged because even the people that are on the right don't seem to be for you at times, as made example by Elon Musk and Ramaswamy. I don't want you to be discouraged. But know that the Lord, he is in the heavens and he laughs at all of these different maneuvers from the enemy trying to suppress the gospel and his church and your families and his people. And so I don't want you to be discouraged, but instead to cultivate a positive vision for the future. Don't become discouraged, but be positive and to continue to fight, to do the reading, to lead your family well, to do your duties. Do not raise your eyes too high, for there's nothing you can do about world powers or global dominion or the World Economic Forum, but instead to look in front of your feet and do the duties that God has given you to do. And so with that, Festival Lenente?
Festival Lentil.
Oh my word.
Yeah, it's actually Festival lentil. Yeah.
And so with that, Festa Nalente.
Festa Nalente?
It's a Norwegian term.
Have a good day.
It
We'll
means
see you next
party
time
on.
on the King's Hall.
Party on. Visit newchristianpress.com/conference.
/2025.
/2025. Dang it.